One more podcast with this funny lighting on my face, but you are going to get used to it. Relationship and friendship. As repeatedly, whoops. Pointer. As repeatedly indicated above, the relationship between partners is fundamental for the success of any capacity development initiative. Although it's possible to talk about relationship between organizations or even international relations, it's important to remember that these relationships are always built on personal relationships between individuals. However, the technocrats commonly involved in capacity development for resilience often forget this and focus exclusively on the tasks at hand. Ignoring the importance of building relationships or trust between partners is not a good idea. Trust is a multifaceted concept that has been applied in various situations and scientific disciplines. One of the more common approaches to trust links the concept to the willingness to be vulnerable under conditions of risk and interdependence. I love this word vulnerable in this context, willingness to be vulnerable, because people think showing vulnerability makes you weak, but weakness and vulnerability are very, very different. Okay, so one has to remember that not only in personal relationships, but in the sense of the relationship of for capacity building that we're talking about. This entails three important things when considering trust between two individuals involved in capacity development. First of all, the concept of trust does not make any sense if there is no relationship between the two individuals in the first place. So credibility and trust have to be established to build a relationship. Only then can you actually go forward and have a relationship. In other words, if both are just minding their own business and are not in any way dependent on what the other one is doing, trust has no meaning. Secondly, the concept of trust has also no meaning if none of the two risk anything in relationship with the other. In short, if there is no likelihood that the actions of one could have any negative consequences on something that the other values, then trust is not important, obvious. However, in situations in which one individual is dependent on another for the state of something that she values, trust entails consciously making herself vulnerable to the impact of the agency of the other person, so the actions of the other person. Going back to capacity development, it's obvious that partners are interdependent and everybody risks various things if sharing information, acknowledging problems, link up activities, etc. Hence, without trust, partners are not willing to do any of that, which in turn undermines the effectiveness of the capacity development initiative completely. Okay, so it's somewhat shocking that such fundamental requisite is so often forgotten or ignored, especially since this mistake generally is repeated over and over again, as we'll see in a minute. Building trust takes time, but open channels of communication and continuity in personal relations support mutual. Oops, did I? I have just repeated the text here. Building trust takes time, but open channels of communication and continuity in personal relations support mutual trust or even friendship, which I come back to later in the section in other ships. Relationships between human beings involve power always and eternally. Moreover, power is an inherent part of relationship between organizations, and societies can be seen as composed of multiple intersecting, overlapping networks of power. However, this is commonly overlooked in capacity development, especially in initiatives that involve international development assistance. This general obliviousness to such fundamental features of our human existence is surprising, but perhaps is a result of a combination of the fact that it is almost exclusively external partners who are the more powerful. and that's why they're allowed to come in, because they bring something we need, and of century-old colonial constructions of how such relationships should be. So we carry this historical baggage from the colonizers. In other words, power is invisible since it follows perceived notions of how most people expect it to be distributed. I'm not claiming that such distribution in any way is the right distribution, but a result of prevailing mental images of us and them among both external and internal partners, which often materializes in overly confident postures of the external partners and lack of self-esteem with the internal partners. Okay, so these are issues that have historically evolved and persist even as of now. So what a steady stream of strangers, then here we'll look at the example of the mistake that are repeated generally and repeatedly. Personal relationships of mutual trust are fundamental requisites for healthy partnerships in capacity development for resilience. It's therefore particularly upsetting to find countless examples of situations in which the formation of such relationships is completely undermined by the basic design of how capacity development is managed in practice. First of all, capacity development for resilience should be a long-term process of change, not short and microized as we said before, but is regularly restricted by short-term funding for 12 to 18 months. This is a systemic issue. Should be development oriented with a substantial planning horizon for its activities, but each activity is often implemented in a rushed and at times even ad hoc manner. Most external partners have also very rapid staff turnover, with people on temporary contracts who get used to move around. Which means they're almost like daily laborers who go from project to project. These three factors result in a steady stream of strangers moving in and out of partnerships in capacity development for resilience with no time to build trustful relationship. As long as external partners ignore this fundamental flaw, the effectiveness of their projects and programs will be severely restricted, and often lots of funds are wasted without fixing these problems. So power here is a dispositional concept in the sense of not being a thing or event, but a capacity for mobilizing and coordinating emotions, thoughts and actions toward ends that are defined. In a partnership for capacity development, power can influence what needs others express and cause them to behave in interest of the more powerful. However, I hope you understood the sentence. In a partnership for capacity development, power can influence what needs others express and cause them to behave in the interests of the more powerful. Okay, so they are just kind of feel obliged or forced to behave in the interest of the more powerful. However, power is not only a matter of one agent having power over another, but also of the power of the collective to do something. Two sides of the power that are intrinsically linked, of course, individual versus collective. Consider, for instance, a meeting of the Tanzania Disaster Relief Committee, which is a committee with decision-making powers consisting of high-level officials from the Prime Minister's office and relevant ministries. This committee has substantial power to allocate the resources made available by the President when declaring a disaster area, direct activities towards specific locations, and so on. Between each of the members of this committee there are relationships of power that may be balanced or more or less asymmetrical, granting some members power over other members in the context of the meeting. These members with power over other members have greater potential for influencing the decisions of the committee, but without such imbalances it might be difficult for the committee to decide anything at all. I'm not saying that it's good that the powerful can dominate the powerless, and to better grasp the workings of power in this context, it's helpful to expand the common notion of power as domination to also include authority and legitimacy. Okay, so authority and power are not always the same thing. When you say you are an authority on a topic, it can mean expertise. When people say he has the authority to tell me to do something, that means there is trust and credibility. Or if you say he has the power to force me to do something, that is something you are afraid to violate the order here, for example. Okay, so let's read this a little bit more. Power, a family of three siblings: domination, authority, and legitimacy. So those should be kept in mind. Most thinking about power focuses on power as domination, which in turn can take three main forms. The most obvious of these is the direct domination, which one agent can force the other agents to comply with a decision on an issue over which there is a conflict of interest between them. So one has the power to say, this is what I want, so you shall do it. Domination here is about controlling decision making. In addition to such direct exercise of power, preventing a decision to be made or even an issue to be brought up for discussion is also a central form of domination. So it's not just about ordering people to do something, but also just not allowing them to do something as well, or not allowing them to express themselves or discuss their issues and views, perspectives, and so on. In other words, domination is also about agenda setting, where you don't have a control on the agenda if somebody else has a power of domination over you. Finally, the third and perhaps the most insidious form of domination is the way potential issues are even kept out of the consciousness of the dominated through the operation of social forces, institutional practices, or individuals' decisions. Let's say access to information, access to finance, access to contraception in many cases, and so on. This form of domination is thus about influencing the very desires, preferences, and motives of the less powerful to suit the interest of the dominant. Okay, this is getting a bit long. Wow, I didn't realize that this is so long. So let's read a little bit more and then maybe I'll split it. In addition to domination, power also includes authority. The word authority connotes the power of or right to give orders, make decisions, and enforce obedience, having power or control, and the power to influence others. It is, in other words, about the power to make commands and have them obeyed. Though this might appear similar to the first form of domination above, it is important to consider that authority may stem from a different source of power or different sources of power. There is significant variation in how influential scholars have used the word authority over the years, even with Foucault, which has even been aggravated by inconsistencies in the different translation of the Weber's seminal work on power. So probably went from German to other languages. However, authority is normally understood as power that enjoys legitimacy, that is, right, official, recognized, etc. I like this because authority does mean that it's a person who has legitimate authority or legitimate right and recognized official right to say something for people to follow, like a teacher telling a student to do something, right? This approach to authority is useful since it helps us to broaden our appreciation of power by distinguishing it from domination that has dominated much thinking about power for the last 4 decades or so. Power is, in other words, not only about coercion, force, and oppression, but also about legitimate authority that is voluntarily obeyed. This is very critical. Parents' authority, teachers' authority, or a person who has legitimate authority in some other form. Okay. Weber explains that such authority can be based on legal grounds, on the acceptance of the rules, regulations, and other formal institutions granting authority to particular actors like the police, for example. Going back to the Tanzanian disaster recovery and whatever meeting above, this kind of authority grants power to some participants over others simply because the legal and institutional framework in Tanzania is designed that way. There are obviously more or less egalitarian human environment systems, but it is difficult to imagine a functioning society without any kind of social contract conferring authority to some actors overseeing and facilitating human transactions. Obviously, this also works through elections where we elect leaders and they have the authority to pass rules or do some corrupt things as well. So that's not legitimate power, or that becomes domination rather than authority. In other words, the power of the collective to perform key functions for resilience is dependent on, like it or not, some actors having power over the others. Similarly, Weber states that authority can be based on traditional grounds, on the acceptance of the norms, values, and other informal institutions, justifying the authority of particular actors in the name of sanctity of tradition. For instance, the authority of the British monarchy, Roman Catholic Church, Fijian House of Chiefs, etc., which had authority, in some legal form. He also states that authority can be based on charismatic grounds, on the acceptance of the specific and exceptional sanctity, heroism, or exemplary character of an individual, endowing her with authority through the devotion others feel toward her. So it is just a consensual power or a tributary power where you are bowing to the authority of someone who is charismatic. Aside from the famous examples of Gandhi, King, and Mandela, there are myriads of less pronounced examples of charismatic authority in many of the informal leaders with significant power out there. However, authority is not always grounded directly in charismatic qualities, but perhaps more often in the recognition of specialized knowledge and skills that grant authority in situations when such human resources are essential. You can also imagine crooked things where an astrologer or priest or some other such authority, which is again about domination rather than authority in this legitimate sense. This might be referred to as competent authority, although that term sometimes is used to refer to a person or an organization that has legal right to perform a designated function in society. Authority is, in other words, a complex concept which I think Hearn summarizes best. When we talk of an authority, sometimes we simply refer to constituted bodies that have the capacity, like it or not, to issue binding orders, for instance, a local government's ability to levy taxes, or a law enforcement agency's ability to issue tickets for traffic infringements. But this attenuated sense shades into some other issues where principled acceptance of authority's power is more explicit. We believe our doctors know their stuff, that our government office holders were elected fair and square, and so on. There are thinner and thicker senses of authority. So you get the idea that authority is legitimate, and yet it can be very complicated. So looks like this one is going on and on. So let me stop here and come back and continue this authority, because we have gone from power to its various shades, and obviously the author is passionate about giving it in all its shades. So this one is already over 18 minutes, so it's better to stop it here and come back. Okay.